All right, welcome to another episode of The Edge presented by the Bluntness. Here we take you behind the scenes with amazing people who are pushing the boundaries today in cannabis and other psychedelics. I'm your host, Gregory Frye, executive editor at the Bluntness, and today I have a very inspiring guest, Dr. Sunil Aggarwal. Sunil is co-founder and director of the Advanced Integrative Medical Science Institute. He is also a palliative medicine physician and associate hospice medical director. Dr. Aggarwal also collaborates with several universities in Washington State. And check this part out. Part of Sunil's background is in medical geography. His focus also includes global health equity, social medicine, health and human rights. And currently, Dr. Aggarwal has a lawsuit filed against the DEA contesting its decision to ban psilocybin use by terminally ill patients. Dr. Aggarwal, thank you so much for joining us. How are things going with you on your end? How are you today?
I'm super today. Thank you so much for having me, Gregory. It's been a long time. I'm so happy to reconnect.
The first thing I really wanted to ask you about is if you could share the where you're at with the lawsuit, the story behind the lawsuit, how this came about on your end, and you know, a little bit deeper on some of the national support that it's been receiving, especially with these amicus briefs. We just heard about this past week.
Absolutely. I mean, it's really straightforward. I work in a clinic, the Ames Institute clinic that I co-founded a couple of years ago. I work with a naturopathic oncologist, board certified, Dr. Standish. So we get a number of patients that have different stages of cancer who come to us for integrative treatment, holistic supportive care, working with their outside oncology team. A lot of times in my role as a palliative doctor, I also help with alleviating symptoms, treating pain, or other aspects of cancer. And so many times I've been using ketamine in my practice already, which is a legally available psychedelic substance, which can have some great effects in patients with cancer or other illnesses like this, to deal with the anxiety, it's the stress associated with the condition, sometimes other trauma that comes up around the diagnosis or other previous unresolved issues. It can really be effective, but there's many other psychedelics out there that could have greater potency and strength, and psilocybin is one that I've been following for a long time, all throughout my training. I worked with the NYU psilocybin research group when I was in residency, and got to see it up close with cancer patients who were getting recruited for the trial there. I tried to even recruit some of my own patients I was seeing there to go get that treatment, but it was very hard for access reasons, because you really had to be outpatient. You had to have a lot of support, because it's a research study and it's very controlled. So I've been, and then of course all of their publications have started coming out from the Hopkins group, the NYU group, the UCLA group before that, in the modern era, showing in controlled clinical trials that you can really make some big differences in psilocybin-assisted therapy for cancer patients, in ways that you could only dream of in palliative care, like that kind of huge, robust response that goes on for so long. So it was in my mind, and I knew that this was happening and coming about, and I knew that right to try was something that had already been adopted. I didn't really have a legal pathway to implement it, because they really weren't giving a lot of rules at the FDA how to actually get right to try access to these medicines. They just said contact the sponsors. And so when I was approached by Catherine Tucker she's an amazing attorney and patient rights advocate who's worked on a lot of issues with end-of-life care, access to medicine, to physician aid in dying, as they call it. Like that's a right that is in many states now, and it's thanks to efforts of her and her organizations that have really helped push that and say, hey, this is an option that should be available, and the federal government shouldn't step on Oregon. That's the sort of famous Supreme Court case that she worked on. So I was familiar with her, and I knew that she was working on psychedelics and palliative care as well, as interested in that. We had met at a conference a couple of years ago, and I just felt like, wow, okay, maybe, who knows, like this, she's starting a conversation in 2017 around this, psychedelics and palliative care, what would be the appropriate setting and use. And it was at the law school. Anyway, so she came back into contact with me through an organization I'm involved with here in Washington called End of Life Washington, which is an advocacy group that helps patients with end-of-life care. And they asked about, well, what do you know about psilocybin? I said, well, yeah, I mean, I think it's important medicine and can really be helpful in palliative care and suffering. And they're like, well, also we have an attorney that is looking for, who has developed a theory around the right to try, has written a law article about how to implement this, and vis-a-vis psilocybin or other psychedelics, Schedule 1. Do you want to talk to her? I was like, oh yeah, I know her, and so we talked, and she asked me if patients of mine have asked me about access to this, and I said it comes up all the time. I mean, or so often that, and people really basically know that there's no way I can prescribe it, so they stop asking about it. It's just sort of in the ether, because of Michael Pollan's book and everything else. So anyway, when she asked me about this, and I did have some patients who had recently seen who really were interested in getting like trying to use this medicine and move the field forward to help other patients. They had this very commonly, many cancer patients, in addition to helping themselves or when they're going through their treatment, they also want to make sure that there's people behind them or their peers have the same access to the kind of medicines that they do. And so I had some patients in mind who, I was treating, and were at different stages of their treatment with cancer. And I asked them if this is something that they'd be interested in trying psilocybin, and maybe if we were into problems trying to fight for it, and they said absolutely, let's do it. That sounds great. So we talked, and that's how we developed. Okay, well, what should we do? And we contacted a producer, and the producer said no, and we don't really do that. And then we looked for other producers, and then we thought, well, we should make it ourselves. And we went through all these different ideas about how to approach it, because we really think that there was a right to this. And then actually we got a lot of support early on, even from Washington State, my authority here. They said, yeah, that's fine, as long as you can get the DEA to sign off. You can cultivate psilocybin fungi and administer that. We understand it. We understand right to try. But finally, when we finally had to reach the DEA, that's when we just realized that none of the agents in our area or the ones in Massachusetts, where there was a producer of psilocybin that was then willing to supply to us if we had the right license, neither of their DEA headquarters in those locations or regional offices had any idea about right to try. A former DEA agent we spoke with, who was like a consultant to help people work with psychedelic medicines, he also didn't know how this would square with the way that the DEA approaches things. A DEA lawyer who worked a lot on the DEA, like nobody really knew, and it was just like, no, the DEA says it's only about research. There's a form, there's a box, that's all it is. That's all you can do. So they hadn't updated any of their their forms or access around the new rules, the new laws that allow access to substances. There could be plenty of scheduled substances that are being researched and would be eligible investigational drugs, but they didn't see it that way. So when we finally wrote to them, Catherine drafted a letter I looked at, and we sent to the DEA, and they basically said, yeah, we get what you're saying, but sorry, we don't, our hands are tied. We got an official letter from them saying, there's no pathway like this. Just be a researcher and do a research study, and right to try doesn't apply because of some blah, blah, blah. So that's when we, getting more and more, Catherine amassing more experts in the law who are all really working on this pro bono, or they're trying to raise their own money to support their fees. They really believe in this. They just said, this is contestable, based on the theories and understanding that we have. And that's how the lawsuit was filed, or the challenge was made. We had to wait a couple of weeks after we got the letter. There's a waiting period, and then we can go directly to the circuit court that's related to where the doctor, and my patients are residing, where I'm licensed. So that's how we got into the Ninth Circuit right away. And it's It's wrote declarations. We, developed these theories. Now there's an opening brief that they've filed. And even before that opening brief, I should say, we were able to petition a motion to expedite the hearing, because there's so many petitions get filed in the Ninth Circuit Court and other courts, and there's always a backlog. But there's something special about the needs of patients with serious illness, as I was saying in the beginning, that they don't have as much the luxury of just sort of getting in line. They need to go to the front of the line. Like, this is like not a it's not a first come first serve. It's like, this is their needs are very sensitive, time sensitive. So what was amazing to see for me, that I had a really grateful, hopeful thought around, was when the court said, we filed a motion to expedite the review process, expedite the entire case, and the Department of Justice lawyers didn't contest it, agreed, yeah, we should move this quickly. And the court said, okay, here's your briefs are due in May, and responses are due a few weeks after that, and responses to that are due after that, and it's like on this track. We've already now filed the openings brief, which was it's an amazing piece of writing. I think they completely looked at the whole history of drug regulation from the early 1900s to the early laws of FDA that regulated medicines for safety, and then later on efficacy, and and they talked in terms of like, is it safe? Okay, great. Then later, is it effective? Because of all the things that happen with thalidomide and other medicines. So they kind of look at that whole history, and then look at the DEA's role and how they have really, DEA is not supposed to be practicing medicine. DEA is not supposed to be involved. Like, the FDA laws really supersede the drug. Those laws are DEA has to accommodate. Their only role is to stop drug diversion and like the problem of drug abuse and all that. And if there's a medically necessary, medically justified thing happening, they're not to get in the way of that. That's not their role. And that it made it very clear. They completely eviscerated the arguments that the DEA had laid out in their letter. And I just thought it's an excellent piece of writing. It's very readable. And then so that happened. And then in the meantime, all these amicus briefs that you're mentioning started getting collected, and I was blown away. I had no idea what was happening there. This is the attorneys working on this, and it turned out my own state's attorney general, got behind my argument that this is an issue that the state of Washington and our lead lawyer is backing us up on. That was impressive. These are they understood that this is a law that the Washington legislature unanimously passed. Like, every legislator voted in favor of getting experimental, right to try access for these kind of medicines for patients. And here the DEA, this agency, is saying, nope, sorry, it doesn't apply for this class because of, we follow the 1970 rules, not the 2017. We're 50 years behind you. We haven't caught up.
As a physician, what is it that you've seen and that you appreciate and that you would like to share about the patient responses to psilocybin? Any specific cases come to mind?
I mean, I really haven't had the luxury of using this in treatment. Just like I said, I heard cases from the psilocybin research team at NYU. They would present their material of the cases that they were patients they were treating in their study with cancer. It was just the same things that everyone knows. These are patients who are racked with this sort of trauma of like the end is near potentially, and so it's kind of a reckoning. And sometimes you can get stuck in the depression, the demoralization, the hopelessness. And any old trauma that you haven't resolved in your childhood or other stages of life, those can kind of come back with a vengeance, and just a sense of meaninglessness and hopelessness, and wish for hastened death, wish for just ending it all, and just there's no purpose. Even though there's avenues that might be available for therapy, for care, and that there's ways that things can be healed, but you can be just so overwhelmed with those feelings. And so I think what I would hear about is that patients who would then work with therapists, have a preparation, set some intentions, and have a psilocybin session guided. there would be these amazing mystical experiences that they would go through, a series of life reviews, feelings of dissolving entirely, and really having a sense of complete closure or of the life course itself, and then experiencing reverie and bliss, timelessness, ineffable sense of deep knowing, sometimes an abiding sense of love, like through their whole body. I mean, just very profound experiences with music and eye shades and support and safety, and it just stays with them. It goes on for hours, and then it stays and it stays and it stays, and it just sort of starts to trickle into their sense of their life and what's important to them. And there's like a transformative experience that's happening with these patients. That I heard one patient that spoke at a conference that I spoke at a number of years ago, who was a kidney cancer survivor who went to Hopkins to do the cancer study that they did, and he was a therapist, and he talked about like serious unwinding of issues that he'd been struggling with for years and years and years, that was able to get resolved that day and with his follow-up sessions. And cancer kind of became like it did not take over his life anymore. It was no longer, it was part of this larger pattern of care. And I think he was doing okay. He had survived the cancer at this point, and it was really around what he needed to live, and to reconnect. So that's what I've seen and heard, with psilocybin patients who have cancer, these significant transformative experiences. I've seen it also with ketamine in some of my patients who have advanced cancer that I've treated. I had a patient who was, in his 60s, who had come here from Maine, to get therapeutic help with cancer, advanced stage 4 prostate cancer. And he'd been also had significant developmental trauma. He'd worked with refugees and through the UN and Africa, and had a lot of trauma around the wars that he'd seen there. For him, the experience of having this psychedelic experience and support, it was around, he traveled the world, and he had a vision of his own, like a cremation ground, a very sacred cremation ground that he saw in India, in the Ganges. Or maybe he hadn't seen it, he'd always envisioned it, but he'd been close to it, and it really became very clear and rich for him what it was like to have this celebration, and solemnness and beauty around his death, around his own death, and what it's like to be moved into the river. That's the metaphor that's used in a lot of Indian rituals around dying, and so that's what came to him. It was he cried, and it was like a really joyous experience for him. He's now passed away, but he did experience significant changes in his level of bodily pain. That he had severe bodily pain from the cancer, the tumors, the stress of all the worsening illness. It changed tremendously for him. He also used cannabis to alleviate that. He had used some opioids, and he stopped using them. And his mood entirely changed. He was more present. Anyway, I feel like these kind of things are possible in cancer patients with this kind of medicine, be it psilocybin, ketamine, ayahuasca. Like so many of these substances, they all have different features, but their common theme is this ability to reset the default mode network, really change get you out of that hyper survival mode, or even the extreme life threat mode, and help you come safely into another mode that is actually more pro healing, which is kind of that social nervous system where you can have more connection. And I think that's what they're doing. And with the support and guidance of doctors and therapists, they can feel more safe, and there's more safety rails. And yeah, I think that's in a nutshell what's happening. And and I should say, this is what happened with the amicus briefs, is that we got the support of a whole medical institution, the Evergreen Health. It's like a 2-hospital major hospice and palliative care system, and many other specialties here in Washington. I trained it as a medical student. They said, yeah, we support this type of therapy for these kind of patients. they thought, let's use a term that says that sort of recognizes that there's the history of this is around spirit, around the spiritual health, spiritual well-being, the spiritual dimension of being alive, which is an important dimension. It's not just sort of a glommed on afterthought. In integrative medicine, integrative health, which is what I practice, and really is a more true definition of health. If you look at WHO and other authorities, spiritual is one axis of health and well-being, just like mental, physical, social are. They're all critical axes in order to have good health. So the spiritual health axis, spirituality, which is around meaning and purpose and connectedness and all these things that we've been talking about, that is what entheogens, so the term, the theo part of the entheo connotes that. The gen means it helps to generate or occasion an experience of the theo realm, and en means, taking within. So it actually comes from words like in Greek, enthusiasm, enthusiastic. It's the same. It has the same kind of etymologies and roots, and so it still has a sort of Greco-Roman or history in that regard. But that's where our English language has roots in that as well. And there was a lot of this is cross-cultural. You see entheogenic practices in Asiatic religions and traditional African religions, the North American, Mesoamerican, North and South American indigenous folks also have these kind of practices. Psilocybin is part of that. Peyote, ayahuasca, cannabis, all these substances have been used in that framework, in that context. And I think entheogen helps us recognize that it's beyond a psychiatric therapy or even a palliative therapy, that it ties to, although I do believe that we are all living with, Artie Lang says that life you see is a sexually transmitted terminal condition with a 100% mortality rate. So everybody is dying. Everybody's living and everyone's going to die. We are all mortal. And so it's necessary for all of us to have some kind of palliation around, that's the fact of our mortality, to be able to renew, to recreate again your connection and meaning in the world is very important, especially when we have the kind of world we live in today with pandemics and mass violence and global climate change and so many things that are just, the ground is shaking. So I think it's the entheogenic description catches a lot larger use history and applicability of psilocybin and such substances. And so I actually like the term entheogenic integrative medicine or entheogenic integrative care, because we can use that framework to also inform how we take care of people in healthcare. Spirituality isn't like tied to any church. It's not like tied to any institution. It's just part of being alive, being human, and you need to know that dimension in order to help people heal. From things like as major as cancer, or as minor as sometimes a serious illness that was short-lived, but really kind of like COVID. I mean, I'm sure people who had mild COVID, definitely had existential concerns.
The last thing I really wanted to ask you is, what are your thoughts on, I know you're challenging the DEA on right to try right now, which is very important. And as somebody who is approaching psilocybin and other entheogens from a public health perspective, I wonder what your thoughts are on the emergence of a psilocybin industry. What are your thoughts, concerns, advice as this starts to unfold?
These are big questions. I have a chapter coming out in a Routledge handbook on, from deep respect after profound neglect. Spiritual health and safety for cannabis and entheogens and other entheogens in an integrative public health system. So I thought about this, and that's just an early piece that I want people to know, but it should be out within the next few months from Routledge. in a handbook of cannabis. But I would just say about this, like, it's really important to me that we continue to involve the spiritual health tradition, the spiritual traditions of our country and other places, the spiritual health experts, whether it's chaplains or even traditions that are around, in helping us guide how to safely integrate this medicine into our lives. It is very important to have that grounding as well, that we need to work in concert. It's not just, I'm not just talking about medicalization, and I'm not just saying it's all religiousification. It's like, we need to kind of use the best that we have in psychotherapy, in medicine, in form integrated medicine, and in, cross-cultural, integrative spiritual care. We have institutions and we have experts in all of these areas and domains in our society, and we need to talk together about how, maybe churches or spiritual institutions that are registered should be the ones helping with licensing and regulation and being involved in, the industry, in selling and purchase, just like churches are involved in dispensing alcohol right now. And churches are involved in dispensing peyote. Certain churches are involved in dispensing ayahuasca in the U.S. under a Supreme Court rule. But I think we need to get away from certain institutions, like, oh, it's only the church that's, has the Bible as their book, or only the church that was founded in the Native American church that was founded in early 1900s in Oklahoma is the one that has these protections. No, it's anyone, because spiritual health has to be universalized. If you're going to do public health with spiritual health, everybody has a spiritual health compass, whether you're an atheist, you pray to whatever God or no God. So how do you do that fairly? Well, it's the same way you treat all spiritual institutions the same. We're not allowed to discriminate. Oh, you've got the book where you mentioned it earliest, so you get the protection. It's really important to me that we start to get out of that colonial mindset, which are the good religions, the protected ones, which are the ones we want to kind of avoid. And it's really funny. I saw an article recently that the U.S. State Department was ranking the spiritual religious tolerance of other countries based on how much they were allowing Rastafarian cultures in those countries, like in the Caribbean or South Africa, to access cannabis for their spiritual practices. Whereas we in our country don't recognize it, and courts have rejected it. But we're telling other countries, oh, you're doing a good job of spiritual, religious freedom and human rights because you're allowing cannabis for your, for groups like the Rastafari. And I just think it's funny to me how we have this sort of total schizophrenia about that. And that's where I want to see this move. There's microdosing. There's so many ways that psilocybin will play a role in our well-being. But I think tying it to the deeper traditions and lineage, which is the spiritual, will, I think, help us steer clear of some safety issues that can happen when medicine's this powerful. Because when you have awe, this is what last thing I want to say. This is called the field of awe. Medicine around awe. You can use awe to generate wonderful feelings of healing, but you can also use awe, depending on what just happens right before and what happens after, to brainwash people into committing mass acts of violence. Awe is also used by cult leaders and hyper fundamentalists to get people to kind of buy into something. So it's really, really important, the setting, having a much larger integrative public health system is going to be, these substances are going to force us in that direction. We just can't do business as usual, because we could end up hurting ourselves or hurting others. So that's, and I think things are moving in that direction. So I'm hopeful. That's sort of, we've done it before. I just feel like this is gonna help us get out of this really money-driven, capitalistic orientation of public health. It's very, very short-term and one-dimensional. I'm hoping that these things are going to prompt us to start to think in a much larger way about public health.